So what we start with is a general behavioral reaction, and that would be, I can't remember anything. I can't remember where my house is sometimes. I start driving down the road and I just kind of lose where I am, and I don't know where I am. So this is a general behavioral reaction that these select individuals are having, and of course then they need to follow it to the central nervous system to determine what part of the central nervous system we're dealing with. Potentially we're dealing with the spinal cord, but probably we're dealing with the brain. And in this case, of course, we're talking about a disease. We have to diagnose this individual with dementia. We have to diagnose this individual with Alzheimer's disease. So we assume that it's in the brain. We can isolate it in the brain. It has to do with memory. Where does memory come from? Obviously, it comes from the brain. We look at the response in the brain, and then we locate the area of the brain that is affected. And of course, we can do this with functional MRIs. We can also do a CAT scan on the individual to see if there's any select structures that there are any problems with. John McCain just had surgery last summer because he had a tumor in his brain. I was talking to a young lady this summer who had exactly the same problem that John McCain had. It's really kind of fascinating too, because instead of, you think of a tumor as a big lump, right? A big glob of cells. Well, sometimes that's not what it is. Sometimes it's just a glob of blood vessels. I had an individual that I was talking to this summer. She had a tumor in the middle of her brain. Luckily, it was operative. What they did, it was in the middle of her brain, and it was on top of her corpus callosum. So they were able to go in between the two hemispheres, and they were able to take it out. And she asked them to save it for her. And when they went in there, it was the size, what did she say? She said it was the size of a tennis ball, but that's really pretty big if you think about it. And what they did, it turned out to be a group of blood vessels. And they said, well, we pulled it down to pieces. She wanted them to save it for her so that she could look at it. But it was just a tangle of blood vessels that were all wrapped around nothing. And they were feeding nothing. And of course, it was putting pressure on the other parts of her brain. That was really the reason that they had these problems, that she had these problems. Really kind of fascinating, this young lady, because she just finished her PhD, and she gave a presentation, not about her tumor, but about something else that didn't have anything to do with tumor. But she told the story, well, she told me the story of her brain tumor. I'm so fascinated. I think she was flirting with me. She was 30 years old, I'm 67. That's the perfect. Anyway, she had just grown hair, which is kind of exciting. You have cancer and they treat you for your cancer, and she was bald-headed, and they had to take a chunk of her skull out. And so while she was bald-headed, before she grew her hair back out, she had this nasty chunk of meat that looked like it had been taken out of her brain. It was flat on top because they'd taken a piece of her skull out. When they put it back in, I don't know, they put it in upside down or something, I don't know. They put it back in, but it sunk in. In order for it to heal, it had to sink in and then push itself back out. And when I met her skull hadn't pushed back out all the way yet. So, when I talked to her this summer, it's kind of fascinating. Why am I talking about this? We're looking for problems. So she had cancer. She had a brain tumor. And it wasn't a chunk of meat, it was just a chunk of blood vessels, just like John McCain's. When they went in, they thought that he just had a circulatory problem. And when they went into his brain, actually they took a piece of his skull out right above his eye, and when they went in there, they found, and it wasn't very large, but it was pushing against the reasoning portion of his brain, his frontal cortex. And of course they pulled it out. And then John McCain came back to Washington right after his surgery, and he was a hero as far as I'm concerned, because he's the one that voted down the Repeal and Replace Act. Good job, John. Well, that's me, of course. Okay, looking at the response in the brain, they locate the area of the brain, and in her case, of course, it was difficult because it was so inclusive. It was pushing against lots of different areas of her brain. From the affected area, they isolate single nerves that are affected, and that's important that we find these areas. They then will look at the chemical changes that take place in the neuron. And of course, once we can find the chemical changes that are taking place in the neuron, then potentially we can treat whatever the problem is, because we can change the chemical structure of things. We can give you a medication that will change the chemical structure. So let's say that you've got Alzheimer's disease. Can we give you something to improve? Can we give you anything to cure your Alzheimer's disease? Is there a medication that cures Alzheimer's? No, there's not. No, there's not. Well, what's the problem? Well, the problem is acetylcholine. Acetylcholine has to do with memory. So we can't replace, and the cells are dying. The acetylcholine producing cells are dying, and that's one of the reasons why you get Alzheimer's disease. So we can't replace the dead cells. We have no way of doing that. But can we increase something else? And the answer is yes. Yeah, we can increase the acetylcholine level in your brain, making you seem more normal. We can't replace the dead cells, but we can replace the acetylcholine. Can we cure it? Can we slow it down? Can we cure it in any way? And the answer is no, of course not. But we can make you seem normal for a short interim, and we do that by giving you a medication that increases your acetylcholine level. And because we're increasing your acetylcholine level, you have better memory. So you recognize people. You can remember where your house is. You can't drive, don't drive. Oh my God, you get lost. Then you'll forget how to push on the brake or something. These kinds of things happen. Anyway, that's the way reductionism works. Using the technique of reductionism, researchers can break down the complex mechanism that leads to brain malfunctions. I was looking this up this morning. We're going to talk about this in the next chapter. Fascinating stuff. We're looking at a cure for cancer. Right now, we're looking at a cure for cancer. One of the beauties of the last 20 years, when did I start working at Children's Hospital? I started working at Children's Hospital in 1983. 1982, 1983. 1982 and 1983, we had no cure for leukemia. We could slow leukemia down. That's all we could do. Oh, thank you. So, I've got one too. Yeah, I got one. We're twins. We both have one of these. Okay. We didn't have a cure for leukemia at the time. And it was a children's hospital. There's nothing sadder than watching a child die of leukemia. And of course, at the time, all we could do is cure maybe 10 or 15%, and the rest of them, there's nothing we could do. It all depended on what kind of leukemia it was, but it was sad. It was really, really, really sad. In the last, when was that? That's 30 years ago. Wait a minute. Am I that old? Yeah, I'm that old. Okay. 40 years ago, we couldn't cure leukemia. In the interim, since between now and then, now we only lose about 10 to 15% of the people that are the children that come down with leukemia. Adults come down with leukemia also, but I'm not really worried about adults. What is heartbreaking is to watch a 3-year-old dying of leukemia, and of course I've seen all those things, unfortunately. So now we can cure leukemia because we have different medications. Why am I talking about this? We're talking about brain malfunctions. And so we use reductionism in order to come up with these new medications. And that's how we cured leukemia. We came up with a new way of doing it. We followed it back to its source, and we figured out what the problem was. Leukemia, the problem with leukemia is that it's not just one thing. It's any type of white cell you have in your body, we can have a type of leukemia that affects that white cell. And if we affect that white cell, the different white cells, and there's 5 major types, of course, and each one of them will kill you faster than the other, or slower than the other. Some of them are relatively slow. About 19% of Americans suffer from some form of psychiatric disorder. That means 1 out of every 5, so there's 6 of you, 7. So maybe 1 or 2 of us have a psychiatric disorder in this room, because 19% of all Americans have psychiatric disorders. Another 3.2% suffer from some neurological disorder. The number 1 neurological disorder in the United States is Alzheimer's disease, and it's expanding. Why are we seeing more and more people with Alzheimer's disease? Are we doing something? Are we poisoning the environment? Is it the aluminum containers that we're drinking out of when we get these? It's bauxite. That's what aluminum is made out of, bauxite. So is it bauxite? Are we poisoning ourselves with plastic containers and all the PCBs and whatnot? Is that what's happening? Why are more?
Or a factor. I said it can be a factor or a possibility because I think all the chemicals that we use today, even household chemicals that we don't even, we're not aware of, are in our system.
Exactly. Maybe it's a chemical that we haven't even discovered yet.
Or it could be some of the food that we eat that's manipulated by the food industry.
Or maybe it's those damn Chinese. Maybe they're putting crap in. Maybe they're putting some crap in the stuff that they send to the United States, and it's poisoning us.
Not enough fruits and vegetables.
Not enough fruits and vegetables. I've got 3 apples and a nectarine for lunch. Huh? I'm such a good boy. So why? And it's happening in industrialized society. So are we poisoning our environment with the smog that we create, the crap that comes out of the backs of our cars? Is that what's causing all this Alzheimer's disease? I mean, it's exploding. What could it possibly be?
My parents have it.
I'm so sorry. It's so hard to watch people who were so functional and all of a sudden they can't remember things. It's just really, really painful to watch. So why is there more Alzheimer's disease now than there ever was before? When I was born, I was supposed to live for 56 years. So I'm 67 right now. I know, I'm doing really well. I was born in 1949. Life expectancy was 56 years old in 1949. And now life expectancy and now we've broken it down by race. It's kind of exciting if you think about that. So as a white person, my life expectancy is in the 80s somewhere. Which only gives me 13 more years. I ought to think about that. Maybe I'll think about that. And maybe not, but my dad lived to be 90, my mother lived to be 98. So there's longevity in my family. But this is just an average. It's just an average. I could live to be 100. I could beat my mom. I used to race her all the time. I beat her. Well, you know, as soon as I got to be, 9 or 10 years old, she couldn't outrun me. So, no more spankings. That was pretty good. She'd catch me is what she'd do. She would fool me. She wouldn't tell me she was ready to spank. She'd grab hold of me really fast so I couldn't run away. Okay. Why? Oh, okay. So the point is, people are living longer now than they ever have before.
There's many factors.
Oh yeah, there are. There's just a myriad of factors, and we don't know exactly which ones they are because we can't look at this person and say, well, this is the factor. This is a factor with this individual. What we need is a general factor. That's what we're looking for. We're looking for one thing that causes, like aluminum or PCBs or whatever, or the poisons that the Chinese put in our food, or in our toys. I don't know. Damn Chinese, you never know what they're going to do. Anyway, Alzheimer's disease, number one neurological problem we have in the United States. The number one problem we have in the United States as far as mental illness is concerned is severe anxiety. Is the number one problem. As you can see, we've got 16 million people with severe anxiety. We only have 10 million people with depression, with severe depression. Schizophrenia, 1.5 million, hardly any. Alcohol and drug abuse is number two. 15 million people suffer from this. Of course, this is expanding because we have this really serious problem with opiate addiction at this point. Opiates are really hard. They're really hard to deal with because if you overdose, and people, you know, your brain's not working very well anyway. And so these people are shooting up, or they're doing what they're taking pills or whatever they're doing, but they think, I feel really good when I'm on opiates, so if I take a little bit more, I'll feel even better. That's the idea anyway. And then they overdose and die. What was it? I just read this. Between 100 and 200 people every day are overdosing on heroin. I don't think they're dying, but they're overdosing on heroin. Two states that are the most affected. Does anybody have any idea which states those are? Places to stay. New Mexico? Actually, no.
Texas.
Texas, right next to New Mexico. No, it's not Texas. I know. Come on, they're right down there on the border. The great thing about opiates, you don't have to. You can get them out. Your doctor can give them to you, and then you can buy somebody else's. I understand that they sell OxyContin and hydrocodone at these flea markets. The one in Window Rock is.
Really?
Feel a little pain, you know, or you don't want to feel no pain.
Wow.
Yeah, I know, it's $5 to $10 per tab, I guess. I don't know. I'm guessing if I went there and tried to hit on some opiates, they would tag me as a narc. That's what I'm guessing. And they'd be pretty close to being true. That's pretty close to being true, because that's what I did in the service. It's one of the things I did while I was in the service. Because I was old. Old people, they needed I collected urine specimens for drug sampling. Well, I'll tell you what,
Ships.
I had lots of people offering me things in order to give them a clean urine. But being the Boy Scout that I am, I never took it. Okay, so there you go. Severe problems that we have in the United States. Depression is number 3. And alcohol and drug abuse, of course, is number 2, but it's rapidly increasing because of the opiate problem that we have in the United States. The 2 states with the biggest problems as far as opiates are concerned, as confusing as this is, New Hampshire is number 2, and number 1 is West Virginia. Turns out to be West Virginia, as confusing as that is. Okay. So when we talk about neurological disorders, as you can see, Alzheimer's is a huge chunk of this, and it's expanding. And the reason is because people are living longer. It's something like 80% of people over 80 years old have some form of Alzheimer's disease. So if you're lucky enough, you won't die of something else. I had a good friend just died at Fort Belknap. She's only 41 years old. I haven't figured out what she died from yet, but she's only 41 years old. She died. A lot of people dying in automobile accidents. You mix this stuff with automobiles, and you become a not a very good driver. And you can't convince people not to drive. Anyway, okay. Let's talk about rats. Much of the research dealing with psychology is done with other species, primarily with rodents, mice and rats. We do a lot of research with mice and rats. If I came up with a new medication that I thought would cure cancer, I would test it on rodents. I would probably test it on mice first and then on rats. In the old days weren't that long ago, about 15, 20 years ago, we used to use primates, but we don't anymore. Because primates are very similar to humans, so we thought we were that much closer. But what we have done is we have bred a form of rat, a species of rat that is very close to humans. I think I told you the story of my Laguna friend who his job was euthanizing beagles. Why beagles? Because their circulatory system and respiratory system is very similar to humans, so that's why they use beagles instead of Labrador retrievers or I don't know what else. They don't do that anymore. We don't use beagles. Of course, they were doing research for NASA, and this was in 71, 72. So we were still doing the space shots. We're not really doing those anymore. We were trying to send people to the moon. And of course, the first moon landing was in 1969. This was in 1971, 72. 72, actually. 93% of animals used in research are some form of rodent, of course. And there's a joke in here. You can throw the top one out. PETA rescue gone bad. You can throw that one out. The rest of this is true. All of these other figures are correct. 36% of the rodents are being used in genetic disease research. Where's cancer research? There's cancer research, it's at 22%. Neurological research, 17.5%. This changes every year because it all depends on where the funding is. So depending on the funding. There's another joke at the bottom, killed during escape attempt. It's a joke. I know. I found a joke on the internet, so I put it up. Okay. All right, let's go to chapter 2. This is really important. The structure of the neuron is extremely important because we're talking about pharmaceuticals and how pharmaceuticals work. So if we understand the neuron, we can understand what type of, understand how these pharmaceuticals are affecting our bodies. Whoops. So we need the basic information about the nervous system. The nervous system is made up of nerve cells, or you can call them neurons if you like, or you can call them nerve cells. There's about 100 to 150 billion neurons in your body, in the average human body, depending on how large you are. If you're smaller, you have fewer. If you are larger, you have more. Neurons communicate with each other at a point known as a synapse. And it's an open place. It's an opening, and that's what synapse means. It means open. So neurons don't touch things. They are suspended above it. They are put in place by other cells that hold them in place. So what happens if a neuron touches what it's supposed to be? It's supposed to be affecting. What happens next? It shorts out. It doesn't work anymore. It's one of the reasons why. If you've ever been around football players, or if you've ever played football, then potentially you have numb places. Your hands, maybe, or your knuckles, or your forearms. You'll have a numb place where the neurons have been smashed together, and now they don't function properly. Another cell that protects and adds structures to the nervous system are glial cells. And we have more glial cells than we have neurons. Potentially twice as many, depending on what area of the body we're dealing with. Anyway, we have lots and lots of glial cells. We have 100 to 150 billion neurons. A neuron is composed of 4 major parts. The dendrite collects the information. The dendrite. And it transmits the information to the rest of the neuron. And dendrite just means tree. So very often it looks like a tree branch, a dendrite. The next part that we're going to be talking about is the soma. Soma means body, and it's the part that with the nucleus in it, as you can see. And so soma just means body, and it has the nucleus. I keep repeating myself. The axon is the main transmitting apparatus, as you can see. Usually they'll just have one axon, sometimes they'll have two, one branching off in one direction, one branching off in the other direction. At the end of the axon is the axon terminal, and that is the portion of the neuron that transmits the information that you're dealing with at that point. Okay, so you've got four areas: the dendrite, the soma, the axon, and the axon terminal. Which part is the most important? Well, all of them are important, of course. The dendrites collect the information. The cell body and the axon maintain the cell, and then the axon terminal, of course, it is connected to whatever it is stimulating. So we need all of these parts. We need all four, of course. Confusing as that is, okay. Neurons can be classified in three basic ways. We classify them by their shape, we classify them by their size, and we classify them by their function. So there are three things that we talk about anytime we're talking about a neuron. We talk about their shape, we talk about their size, and we talk about their function. As you can see, they look different. Multipolar neurons have many dendrites and a single axon. Most neurons of the vertebrate brain are multipolar, and the more things that you have done in your life, the more things that you've tried to remember, the more intricate that your brain cells are going to be. If you've lived in an environment that was relatively simple with very little stimulation, your brain won't grow. And this is one of the reasons why when we talk about babies and how you need to stimulate them, this is what we're talking about. The more stimulation they get, the smarter they're going to be, the more functional they're going to be. The less stimulation they get, the less functional they're going to be. We've seen this with orphans in Romania. The Romanian government decided that they would take all the babies away from their mothers and fathers because they thought the state could do a better job of raising these individuals. And if the mothers and fathers raised them, it's a fairly independent-minded country, Romania was. So they were afraid if they allowed the mothers and fathers to raise them, then there would be revolution. This is a guy by the name of Ceausescu that was in charge of Romania from the end of World War II until the 1980s. Smart guy, fascinating fellow, decided that he was going to build all these huge orphanages, and this is where he was going to build his clone army. You think I'm kidding. He was going to build his clone army. He needed boys and girls because he needed them to reproduce so that, we could get the stormtroopers. Of course, Star Wars came out in the 1970s, but he started doing this in the 1950s. So he started building all these huge orphanages. The problem was that the children, they housed all these, they could house all these children, they could feed all these children, but there weren't enough people to stimulate the children. And they were afraid of what kind of stimulation the children would get. Remember, this guy's paranoid, and he's really afraid that the independent-minded Romanians were going to overthrow him, and he was looking for a clone army, is what he was looking for. So he raised all these orphans, and unfortunately there wasn't enough stimulation. So most of these individuals had an intellectual deficit, and it was because of lack of stimulation. When Ceausescu was executed, finally they overthrew Ceausescu in the 1980s. He was executed, and they discovered, these were secret, by the way, we didn't know about them. Our brilliant CIA didn't know about them. So we went in there, we didn't go in there, but the Romanians suddenly opened the doors of these orphanages and they saw all these children walking around. Can barely talk. They're not getting any stimulation. They had really serious social problems. So the younger ones, they actually fostered out to other countries, and some of them came to the United States. Now eventually, of course, if they have a normal brain, you can stimulate that brain so that it is functional. It's relatively functional. And that's what's happened with the Romanian orphans. If they were geniuses, and they were, of course, there's self-stimulation that can take place, and that's what happened with select individuals. And we were hoping that that's what we were getting in the United States when we were taking the orphans, but of course not always. Sometimes we were getting individuals with a relatively low IQ who you couldn't stimulate very much, and it was really kind of a tragedy. Anyway, so the brain has to be stimulated. Let's say that. The more stimulation it gets, potentially the smarter the individual is going to be. So if you were picked up a lot, if you were talked to a lot, especially talking is very important. The communication between you and your child, extremely important. So if that happened, then potentially you will live up to your potential. So if you have an IQ a potential IQ of 140, if you have a potential IQ of 140, then you will be stimulated to the point that you have an IQ of 140. Of course, you can't go beyond your mental capacity, but the less stimulation you get, the lower your IQ is. Okay, so most of the cells, the neurons in the brain are multipolar. Bipolar neurons have a single dendrite at one end and a single axon at the other. Most of the neurons of the sensory system are bipolar, especially those of the retina and olfactory system. One of the beauties of this is that if you've ever burned your tongue or you've ever smelled, those of us who've been around chemicals, the military does these things to us all the time. We get around chemicals, they fry our noses, we sniff in, and all of a sudden we don't have, it's like ammonia, you know, if you go, gee, I wonder what bleach smells like, and you take a good sniff, you destroy your olfactory neurons. Luckily, they are easily reproduced, being bipolar neurons, and they will be relatively easily replaced. It's the same way with the neurons in your eye. If you damage your eye, if you rest your eye if you sleep, all you have to do is go to sleep one time, your eyesight will come back. Potentially your eyesight will come back because these bipolar neurons will be regrown and your eyesight will come back the next day. Has anybody ever gotten something in their eye that they had to take out and left a hole in your eyeball? Has that ever happened to anybody? No, okay. They just yank the thing out and your eyeball will heal. And all that you have to do is wait for a day and it'll heal right up. Very painful, very irritating if you get something in your eye. Okay, nobody's had anything in their eye except me. Seems to happen to me all the time. As sad as that is. Monopolar, mono means one, of course. Monopolar neurons have a single branch coming off the soma that branches in two different directions. One branch will be the input direction and the other branch will be the output direction, but there are axons going in both directions, and that's the monopolar cell. Some neurons are very large and some neurons are very small. Let me explain to you the large ones. The largest neuron in our body runs from the top of our buttocks all the way down to our heel. So if you're really tall, this thing is like feet long. It's just a single neuron, and it runs up from here down to there. The sad part is that it goes through, it's protected by a sheath. And if that sheath, something happens to that sheath, then that neuron will be stimulated and it'll give you pain. It controls your legs. It's really kind of interesting. It's called the sciatic nerve, and there's a sheath. Potentially, it can get out of that sheath, and then you have an exceptional pain. My mother had sciatica for, 10 or 15 years. Really kind of tragic. Sometimes she couldn't get out of bed. It was so bad. And then one day, of course, she swore. My mother was terrible at swearing. Oh, I told you the story about my mother swearing. And she was a nurse, so she's going to the doctor. And so what did the doctor do? Did he give her physical therapy to try to reseat the thing? No, he didn't do that. What he did was he gave her pain pills. He gave her ibuprofen. She was up to 1,500 milligrams of ibuprofen, which is about 3 times as much as anybody wants to take. And it wasn't working very well. So one day my mother, she gets angry a lot. So one day she got pissed off. She decided, I don't care how much it hurts, I'm gonna get up and I'm going to go and do some work in the garden or something. Anyway, so she got up and of course she's in a lot of pain, and she put on her socks, and the way she put on her socks, she lifted her leg up, and she hyperextended her foot in order to put her socks on. And when she put her sock on, she had shit socks. But when she put her sock on, when she hyperextended her foot, she lifted her knee up to her chest, it receded that sciatic nerve. She went back and she just reamed the doctor. Here you are, you've been poisoning me with all this ibuprofen all this time, and all I needed to do was put my damn sock on. You know, it was one of those kind of deals. Anyway, my mother. Sciatic nerve. So try that. If you ever get sciatica, try putting your socks on while standing on one foot. It worked for my mother. She was in her 60s when it happened. So just a thought. Sometimes, if you stretch these things, they'll go back into place. Even nerves will go back into place. Carpal tunnel, of course, is where you crush the carpal tunnel that runs from here to here, and so you have lots of hand pain and wrist pain. And sometimes, if you keep your wrists stretched, yeah, it will affect your carpal tunnel, make it better, actually make it better. So you might try that. Anytime you get anything that's a nerve pain, of course the Marine would think about that. That's good, I like it. Examples of small cells would be granule, spindle, and stellate neurons. Remember, there's billions of neurons. I'm not going to name them all. These are just 3 more names for little bitty tiny neurons. Examples of large neurons would be pyramidal cells, Golgi cells, and Purkinje neurons. And we have specific areas of our brain where all of these things, we have all these types of monster neurons. So we're going to talk about that. The cerebellum has Purkinje cells, I think. I'm pretty sure. It's got one of them anyway. Functionally, neurons either receive stimuli, create a response, or connect the two, the stimulus and the response. Sensory neurons collect the stimulus and pass the message on to the vast network of connector neurons or interneurons. And at this point I was going to show you all the drugs, and because the drugs talk about vesicles and they talk about things blocking receptor sites, but you've already seen it, so I'm not going to show it to you again. That's what a pyramidal cell looks like, as you can see. One of the interesting things we're going to talk about is schizophrenia. This is very organized, as you can imagine. As you grow your brain, as you stimulate your brain, these things grow to be massive. But they are organized. They're organized in a specific pattern. They're organized in columns. So when you have a thought, if I'm trying to think of something from my past, and next week I go to my 50th high school reunion, as exciting as that is, wait until I come back with all my stories. They're going to be so old. All the people I talk to are going to be so old. Who are all you old farts? They're all retired. I'm not retired. Anyway, so they're in columns, as you can imagine. Now this is a good thing. However, when you suffer from schizophrenia, those pyramidal cells, all those columns become disorganized. This is something we discovered. Tracing schizophrenia back. The reason psychology is a field is because of the problems of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. It's because of the psychoses. If it wasn't for that, there would be no psychology. Initially, psychology started trying to fix these people. We knew it was a problem of the mind. So that allowed anybody with a person in their family that was schizophrenic, they wanted to know what was wrong with them. So then they started paying people to learn about what's going on in the mind. And as time has gone by, of course, now we've used reductionism to try to figure out what's going on with schizophrenia, why schizophrenia occurs. And as it turns out, all we need to do, if you have a proclivity for schizophrenia, all we need to do is stimulate you in a select way, is to force disorganization in those cells, or in these neurons, and you develop schizophrenia. So if you have schizophrenia in your family, the last thing you want to do is smoke pot, because pot will kick you into schizophrenia. And if maybe the last thing you want to do is use cocaine or crystal meth, because that will kick you into schizophrenia faster. The wonderful thing about, if you ever want to know what it feels like to be schizophrenic, then snort cocaine. Because all of a sudden, you're overstimulated. You're overstimulating those neurons. And that's what it feels like to be schizophrenic, except with cocaine it goes away after about 10 or 15 minutes. But with schizophrenia, it lasts, for the rest of your life, which is not that much fun. And in order to control the way your neurons are functioning, you have to take medication to quiet things down. As confusing as that. Anyway, medications. I can make you schizophrenic with medications. As exciting as that is. Motor neurons connect to muscles or glands and create the response by making the muscles contract or changing the activity of the gland. And those are motor neurons. Lots of different types of cells. Neurons do not touch each other but communicate between dendrite of one neuron and the axon of another or across a gap known as the synaptic cleft. So it's an electrochemical response, is what it is. Initially, it's a chemical response, and the chemical response creates an electrical charge inside the neuron, and that's where the stimulation comes from. At the end of the axon is the axon terminal. The axon's in an expanded areas called buttons or boutons. This is the French word for this. Boutons. Okay. So they're buttons. Where are the buttons? Let me see the buttons. Oh, there they are, down here. Okay. And that's important. Okay, so we've got boutons up in the axon, and it's going to release a neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter is going to cross the synaptic cleft, and it's going to attach to receptor sites in the receiving whatever this is, whether it's a dendrite or whether it's a gland or a muscle. There are receptor sites along here, and those receptor sites will collect the neurotransmitter. And that's how it's stimulated, by the use of neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are really important. Sometimes we don't have enough, sometimes we have too much. If we're overstimulated, if we have too much, what are we doing? So we're walking across the room, if we have too much acetylcholine communicating with our muscles, we can't walk quite right because we're getting too much stimulation, so we can't function properly. That's the beauty of the human body, is how often do we have these problems walking across the room? Well, sometimes we have those problems walking across the room when we have Parkinson's disease, if you've ever been around somebody with Parkinson's disease. They have to think about moving, so they have a hard time moving. I've got a film of somebody with Parkinson's disease, and the way that this guy's able to walk across the room is by kicking his cane. And if he kicks his cane, he's fine. He can walk all the way across the room. If he doesn't, it's not that he's using his cane to hold himself up, it's the fact that he has to think about something, and what he has to think about is kicking the cane, and then he can push his foot forward. Otherwise, his feet don't work quite right, his legs don't work quite right. So neurotransmitters are extremely important. If we don't have enough serotonin in our brains, then we're unhappy. But usually we have enough serotonin in our brains. If we want to feel really happy, we can overstimulate our serotonin-producing cells. And that's what ecstasy does. It overstimulates our serotonin, allowing us to have more serotonin in our system. LSD does the same thing, but it's a hallucinogen, so it changes it allows one area of the brain to stimulate the other area of the brain, so that we can see smells and and taste colors and all those other, it's known as synesthesia, and that's what LSD does. It expands your mind, dude. You know what it does, it confuses your mind, dude. And it makes one part of your brain think that it's being stimulated and it's actually not. The end of the axon is known as the presynaptic zone. The area of the receiving dendrite is known as the postsynaptic zone. The message is actually transported by a chemical known as a neurotransmitter, we talked about that before, that is contained in the spheres and the axons called the synaptic vesicles. So these are the synaptic vesicles, and they have the neurotransmitter in them. When they are stimulated, they release the neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter will come down to the synaptic cleft and get into the synaptic cleft. It'll be released by the synaptic cleft. And once that happens, of course, then it crosses and it stimulates the receptor sites. It is collected in the receptor sites. So there is a point where it is released from the axon, and there is a point where it's collected at the other end of the synaptic cleft. And those are the receptor sites. This is all very important. If we have too much, if we don't have enough GABA in our system, then we feel anxiety. And one of the things that marijuana does, it makes us paranoid. Why? Because it reduces the amount of GABA in our system. And it makes us paranoid. So people who smoke a lot of pot tend to be relatively paranoid. And the worst time is not when they're smoking pot, it's when they're not smoking pot. They get paranoid. Now, pot makes you feel good, doesn't it? It makes you happy. It's supposed to make you feel good. It's supposed to make you happy. So what happens when they're not smoking pot?
Paranoid.
They're not only paranoid, but they're grouchy as hell.
Oh.
When somebody's smoking pot, everything is interesting. Everything is interesting. They're fascinated by everything. Isn't that great? The problem is, when they're not smoking pot, everything is boring as hell.
And they have a temper.
Oh yeah, they have a temper. And they're paranoid at the same time. Well, this sounds like a great drug. Let's all use it all the, well, we'll have to use it all the time, because otherwise we'll get paranoid and grouchy and bored. So people that have been around a lot, an individual that smokes a lot of pot, as long as they're smoking pot, they're okay. It's when they're not smoking pot, everything's boring, nothing. Play a video game, no, it's too boring. Everything's boring. Television's boring, video games are boring, everything's boring. So it seems like one of those drugs that everybody should do it. I mean, if you read their websites, it sounds like everybody should do it, but the reality, of course, you get the rebound reaction when you're not using it, as confusing as that. And that's not confusing at all. You always get the opposite reaction when you're not using your drug, especially if you overstimulate. And of course, that's why people use marijuana to overstimulate themselves, to make themselves feel better, to do something to their system. Why don't I have a clock? All right. One of the interesting areas of study dealing with neurons are projections coming from the dendrites called spines. And this is what we're talking about, muscle memory. You need to do it 3 times, and then these spines are not permanent, actually, but they are kind of. They know that they have to be there. And that's what the muscle memory is if you are an athlete. These spines seem to change with experience and have been known to change within seconds when an individual is exposed to a novel stimulus. So we get these spines, and this is us learning things. This is how we learn, using these spines. So you need what? 3. You need to do something 3 times, and then these spines become relatively permanent. And I talked about downregulation and upregulation last time. When you take a drug, when you take something that stimulates you, the first time you take it, you will get, there. Of course, you've got the normal number of receptor sites, and so you get an extreme reaction. But of course, your brain's trying to protect itself, so the next time you take that drug, the body will downregulate, and it will reduce the number of receptor sites, so you'll never get the same effect that you got the first time, unless you use more of it. And that's the problem with crystal meth. The first time you take crystal meth, you only have to take a little bit, and you get this extreme reaction. It's the same way with cocaine, it's the same way with speed. People have increased the amount of speed or crystal meth that they use by 100 times in a matter of months. So they're using that much more, which is really good if you're the one selling the drugs. Because all of a sudden, in order for them to feel good, they have to buy 100 times more than they did. You can give away the first dose. It's okay. You want people to come to the party and use your stuff, because next time they'll need to double it, and the next time after that they'll need to double it again, and pretty soon, this is the way it works with heroin, pretty soon they're buying hundreds of dollars worth every day. And it's really it's a tragedy as far as I'm concerned. But this stuff doesn't really work on me very well. More opiates don't work on me. So, I don't know. Anyway, okay. What I was showing is the structure of the neurons, as you can see. We have all these neurons massed together, and they're different shapes, they're different sizes, they're different lengths, and they all have the same soma, they all have the same axon, they all have dendrites, and they all have axon terminals. The axon projects from the soma in an expanded area known as the axon hillock. And the reason that we're telling you about all of these different areas is because different medications will affect different areas of the neuron. Will stimulate or it will affect select areas of the neuron. The electrical impulse begins in the widened hillock and intensifies as it moves into the narrower axon proper. So it starts in the hillock, it starts in that expanded area, and then it runs down the axon to the axon terminal. Almost all neurons have only one axon. However, some have axons that divide and form several branches. This branching is known as axon collaterals. So you may be dealing with different structures, and that's really the point. I'm not going to ask you a question about axon collaterals. All I want you to understand is there are a lot of different shapes and sizes and different structures. As confusing as that may be. When someone smashes their finger, the stimuli must follow a nerve pathway to tell the brain that it has happened. If you've ever burned yourself or if you've hit yourself in the finger, it seemed like the reflex action was not really that fast. I mean, it took nanoseconds. It took an amount of time. I mean, potentially you should just move your hand right away if something's hot. But if you actually burn your hand, it seems to take a little bit of time for you to move your hand. And that's because of we're dealing with the spinal column, and the information has to travel up your arm to your spinal column, then it has to travel back down to your hand, and then you move it. The information is sent to the spinal column through afferent neurons, and it comes back through efferent neurons. And this is a reflex action. If you burn yourself, you automatically pull your hand away. When I was working in a cement block factory. We were making cement blocks. I don't know if you've ever picked one of those damn things up, but they're heavy. Okay. And we would stack them in cubes. You know, it's a rectangular thing, but if you put 3 this way and 4 this way, then you can make a cube, and that's what we did. We stacked them in cubes. So the thing weighs, I don't know, 25, 30 pounds, something like that, each concrete block. Isn't that about as much as a concrete block? I don't know. Anyway, we're stacking it, it's like 150 in a cube. And you move them on pallets with a tow motor, with a forklift. So I was in the back, and we were stacking these things. We were stacking these cubes of concrete blocks in the back. And I was guiding the guy as to where he needed to put the things. And he's from Kentucky, and I don't know if that has anything to do with it, or the fact that he'd had his beer for lunch. I don't know if that had anything to do with it. Anyway, he put the pallet down on my foot. Now your automatic reaction, I mean, this thing weighs like 2 tons. So your automatic reaction is to pull your foot out. But something told me, don't pull your foot out. Because if you do something like that, if it's pinning your foot to the ground and you try to pull it out, you're gonna pull all the ligaments in your ankle or something, something horrible is going to happen. So I got 2 tons of concrete blocks on my foot, and I'm just sitting there going, move it up, move it up, move it up, it hurt like the devil. And because I didn't pull my foot away, I didn't injure my ankle, I didn't break any bones. Yeah, okay. So he did. He moved it after a couple minutes, a couple seconds, and of course he's laughing the whole time because he just put this thing down on my foot and crushed my boot. That was the worst part. Anyway, so I was afraid, I'm hobbling around all the rest of the day. I had a bruise on the top of my foot, and that was the only problem I had. But if I tried to pull my foot out, I potentially would have gained some ligaments in my ankle or something. Anyway, everything's fine. Don't worry, I can. And after that, was that really? Yeah, after that I still ran track, so obviously I didn't injure myself. And I was really, really fast. So. It's not like my foot's flopping out here and I'm running along and my foot's just flopping around. Oh, wonderful. Okay, so the soma manufactures proteins that maintain growth and function in the neuron. Proteins are really important because this is feeding the neuron. The neuron needs protein. The neuron is made up of protein. So where do we get our protein?
From the meats, chicken.
There you go. That's where we get it. We need protein. We need protein in order to make our bodies function properly. Protein. Now, this is kind of good news because that's the meat that we eat. So when people say you're going to become a vegan, and if you become a vegan, your brain will expand. Well, probably your brain will shrink because you don't have enough protein. The protein is structured in the form of cholesterol. So cholesterol is really very important. Now the question is, how much cholesterol do you need? And the answer is not that much. But in order to maintain all the cells of our body, we need cholesterol. And this is a problem that individuals that are vegans really do have because they're not getting the right amino acids. Protein is a amino acid structure. So you have to take in all of the amino acids in order to build up your body properly. So you have to have a good diet. And of course, if you eat meat, you've got most of the protein, most of the amino acids that you need. But if you're a vegan, you have to put together all kinds of interesting foods in order to create all the amino acids that you need. And one of the problems that vegans have is sometimes their diet is lacking in just one amino acid. And if that's the case, then they don't look very good. Beans and nuts.
For the vegans, to get their protein is beans, the legumes, all kinds of beans out there, and soy.
They eat soy.
Yeah, and
No,
tofu.
Tofu, yeah, that's made out of soybeans. One of the interesting things about soy, I don't know how interesting this is, but soy has a phytoestrogen that mimics estrogen, the human estrogen. Soy does. I know, it's kind of confusing. So if you consume too much soybeans, too much soy milk, then potentially it'll raise your estrogen level. Well, if you're a female, that's okay. But if you're a male that wants to stay a male, he's potentially taking in too much estrogen. And in which case it will change his personality, it changes physical structure. He'll start growing man boobs, as confusing as that is. He'll start gaining breast tissue if he eats too much soy. Whoops. And there are some people that, of course, are lactose intolerant, so they drink soy milk. And of course, sometimes, if they drink too much soy milk, if they're not consuming other things to replace their protein, then it can raise their estrogen level. That's confusing. Of course, you don't notice it in females because, well, they have estrogen, a lot of estrogen anyway. But it can also affect the testosterone, because testosterone has to do with your sex drive. So, it also affects the structure of your face. Everything is made out of protein. I mean, you know, the way your face is put together, the color in your face, is all of this stuff is affected by protein. So if you're a vegan and you're not taking in proper amounts of amino acids, all the beans and all the nuts that you need to take in, then you can become anemic. You can also, it'll change your complexion. One of the more famous vegans in the world is Kirsten Dunst. I don't know if you remember her from all the strange movies she's made. She was in the first Spider-Man movie. She was in that strange movie about cheerleaders. That was Kirsten Dunst. Anyway, my son used to be an actor in Hollywood, and he'd run into Kirsten Dunst from time to time at the coffee shop, not that they were, okay. But anyway, he'd run into her from time to time. And he said when she wasn't in makeup, my God, she looked horrible. Her skin was pale and blotchy, and it had to do with the fact that she was a vegan, and she wasn't always getting the right structures, the right things that she needed. You don't see her a whole lot anymore. Maybe because she's too old to look like the teenage girl that she was before. But it also may be that she doesn't look very good at all. And that, of course, the last time he saw her was like 10 years ago. So Kirsten Dunst had a really serious problem because she was a vegan. As long as you can take in all the proper amino acids, you're okay. You should be okay. But of course, sometimes people are allergic to, I don't know, nuts or legumes or whatever. In some parts of the world, they eat a lot of beans. South Africa, in the sub-Saharan Africa, they eat a lot of beans. Why am I talking about this? We're talking about proteins. The protein is able to make its way down into the distant area of the axon and dendrites by a process known as axonal transport. This is extremely important today because we're looking for a cure of cancer that deals with the microtubules. The protein is moved along tiny hollow cylinders known as microtubules. And what we're trying to do is affect these microtubules, and if we can do that, we can stop metastases. Cancer is a growth, and as long as it stays where it initially starts growing, it's not that hard to knock out. We can use your immune system to knock it out. However, if it moves, if it goes from wherever it starts to someplace else, it's known as metastasis. And the only way it can go from one place to another is by creating a protection for itself. And the protection that it creates for itself is known as human chorionic gonadotropin. So it starts producing this human chorionic gonadotropin, and whereas before the immune system was keeping it all in one place, with this human chorionic gonadotropin, if it moves to another place, the immune system doesn't know that it's a foreign body. It sees it as its own structure. And right at this second, all of us in this room are combating cancerous growths in our body. Things that aren't working quite right. And our immune system is killing it. It's taking care of it. It's arresting it right now, all of us, because that's what the immune system does. So we don't have to worry about cancers unless we become immunocompromised or unless we get a growth that metastasizes. And if it metastasizes and it uses that human chorionic gonadotropin, now your immune system can't knock it out anymore. And this is the biggest problem with cancer, is metastasis. If it metastasizes, then it starts growing and the human body doesn't know that it's a cancer anymore. And now you get growth all over the place, as confusing as that may be. Okay, so human chorionic gonadotropin, what is that stuff? Human chorionic gonadotropin is the substance that embryos create to protect themselves from the mother's immune system. The mother has an immune system that normally will, if it's an alien structure, it will destroy it. That's what your immune system is there for. But the embryo will start producing human chorionic gonadotropin to protect itself from the mother's immune system. And that's the reason that we're all here, is because of human chorionic gonadotropin. Now, the exciting thing about human chorionic gonadotropin is not only that it allows you to grow as a fetus, but it also tells the doctor that the woman is pregnant. Because that's what we measure in the clear blue easy when you urinate on that little stick. That's what we're measuring in the clear blue easy. That's how we can determine if somebody's pregnant, by measuring their human chorionic gonadotropin. As exciting as human chorionic gonadotropin is. So it's good when it allows you to make a baby, to have a baby for that baby to grow. It's a good thing. But when it metastasizes, when a cancer cell metastasizes and uses human chorionic gonadotropin, now all of a sudden it's a bad thing. And what we're doing, what we are trying to determine now is how we can stop the metastasis. And one of the ways that we can do that is by blocking the microtubules of the cancerous cells. So the medications that they're starting to experiment with are ones that block the microtubules. They block the protein that is being pumped down into the rest of the neuron. So we not only have microtubules, we also have filaments in here, the microfilaments and neurofilaments that feed the rest of the neuron. This is really important. And we've never actually looked at the structure before. We've never really needed to look at the structure until we started trying to develop pharmaceuticals that could fight cancers. And this is really an exciting time as far as cancer research is concerned, because we're looking at these microtubules, the neurofilaments, and the microfilaments trying to block the cancer from growing. And we're doing a pretty good job. One of the things that happened with John McCain was that they used an experimental drug. They're using an experimental drug on him. So I don't know if it's this kind of a pharmaceutical or not, but they're using an experimental drug on his brain cancer. So we'll see what happens next. He's already the hero of people that like the Affordable Care Act, well, we'll see what happens next, like I said. Glial cells are part of the neuronal system in that they provide structure. Don't let me go over. My watch doesn't really work. Well, it does, but I can't read it.
10,
okay.
12.
Thank you so much. Glial cells are part of the neuronal system in that they provide structure to the neuronal groupings and help hold them into place, and they help maintain the neurons by feeding them. Glial cells are extremely important, and like I said, there may be 3-4 times as many glial cells as you have neurons in your body. There's 4 different structures, and the structures are kind of important. Yeah, they're pretty important, because these are the structures that protect your brain. If you're a football player and you're banging heads with other individuals, you're causing minor damage in your brain. It is these glial cells that will either protect your brain or not protect your brain. Astrocytes, microglial cells, these are the 4 different types of glial cells: astrocytes, microglial cells, oligodendrocytes, and Schwann cells. Fascinating stuff. These are the things that protect your neurons. This is the reason why you can walk around without damaging yourself. You can hit your hand on the table without your hand going down, because the neurons are still functioning. This is how football players can go play after play after play. How long is it? 15-minute quarters, isn't it? So it's an hour. They bang heads for an hour and without going stupid. Some of them are. These kids that are they're playing football at pee-wee football when they're 8 or 9 years old, and then they become pros and they play into their 30s. They're a mess. They're a real mess. Not only are their joints blown out, but now we're discovering that their brains are blown out as well. Who's the guy, the quarterback for the Cubs, the Chicago Bears? What was that guy's name? He won the Super Bowl. I can't think of his name. Anyway, the man has Alzheimer's disease to the extent now that he doesn't recognize his girlfriend. I guess they never got married. Anyway, not important.
Is that what happened to Muhammad Ali too?
That's exactly what happened to Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali was an amazing fighter. I remember Muhammad Ali when the first time he fought. I didn't see it on television, of course, back then you couldn't. There were only 3 channels back then. This is 1963. But he kicked the crap out of Sonny Liston. And Sonny Liston didn't touch him. And through most of his early years of boxing, nobody touched him. He was so quick, nobody could punch him. Of course, he had started fighting way back. And he won an Olympic gold medal, so I mean, that's the kind of boxer he was. But he was a lower weight. He was a cruiser weight, middle heavyweight. He wasn't a heavyweight, and he moved up to heavyweight in order to fight Sonny Liston. And nobody could touch him because he was so quick. That's what happened with Mike Tyson, too. Mike Tyson was so fast, his hands were so fast, nobody could punch him. And then eventually, things slowed down. As far as Mike Tyson was concerned, he started using drugs, started smoking pot. It slows you down. Marijuana does that, it slows you down. Now all of a sudden, he's using his forehead as a battering ram. And so he's not fighting like he used to fight. You know, before, his hands were so fast that he'd win all of his fights. Same way with Muhammad Ali. After Muhammad Ali went to prison and then came back out for draft dodging, he was a draft dodger. After he came back out, he wasn't as quick. He wasn't as quick on his feet, his hands weren't as fast, and now all of a sudden, of course, they're punching him in the head. And if you looked at a brain scan of Muhammad Ali later in life, after he gave up boxing, the whole center of his brain was hollow because of all the damage that had been done. Football players are the same way. That's one of they talk about CTI and whatnot. Yeah, this is a really serious problem. So it's these cells, these glial cells are what protect your brain. I've fallen on my head a couple times. But there seems to have been no damage. I played soccer. I don't know if you've ever played soccer. And of course the soccer ball's not that heavy, you know, it's not that big, you know, it comes at you, it hits you in the head, and of course you're trying to guide it into the goal or whatever you're trying to do. But I'll tell you what, if somebody hits a really, really high shot, and you've got to guide that thing with your head, it hits your head like a shot put. By golly, I'm glad I gave up soccer because for one thing I wasn't very good. But for another thing, it hits your head like, has anybody ever played soccer? Yeah, hits your head like a shot put, doesn't it? You're playing defense, yeah, somebody drills the ball into the back. Of course, you've got to control it because you've got that speedy little guy coming at you. So you just try to pop it back into the midfield. Hit your head like a shot put. Astrocytes are the star-shaped glial cells that protect the neuronal bundles, especially in the brain. So the astrocytes are really important. They're very strong. They're very powerful cells. So the more astrocytes you have in your brain, the more protective structure you have in your brain. And this is one of the reasons why one guy can get hit in the head with a 100 mile per hour fastball. It doesn't hurt him. And another guy, he has a concussion, and they have to take him out. And as Joe will tell you, this is what happened to Brandon Belt, our first baseman. He's been out for 3 weeks with concussion because somebody hit him in the head. Joe Panic, second baseman, first baseman's gone, second baseman gets hit in the head with a 100 mile per hour fastball. He's out now, and he's got concussion. Somebody else can get hit in the head, they're not too bright anyway, so nobody cares. You know, Sandoval gets hit in the head, and he's got that big melon head of his. You know, no concussion, but Belt gets knocked out, Panic gets knocked out. So here we've got 2 giants, and that's why our season's so bad. No, our season's so bad because our stupid ace pitcher decided he was going to go four-wheeling in Colorado and broke his clavicle. I'm sorry, did I say that? I meant something else. Let me finish this one and then we'll stop. Is it about time?
10:18?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So you have a protective covering over your brain. It's called the dura mater. And this is made up of astrocytes. So if somebody tries to stab you in the brain, this thing it's really hard, yet you can cut through it, of course, but it's really hard to get through, and that's where your protection comes from. So your astrocytes make up this protective covering over your brain. Astrocytes contribute to the metabolism of the neurons and provide restorative protein to them. One of the things we're going to find out next time is that there are glial cells that actually repair your brain, and these are very important. As you start getting Alzheimer's disease or dementia, these cells become less functional. And because they become less functional, they can't take out all the stuff that shouldn't be in there, all the bad stuff.